Part 1. The community center auditorium smelled of old wood and lemon polish, a scent that had become familiar to anyone who attended the monthly piano recitals hosted by the Westbrook Music Academy. On this particular Saturday afternoon in March, folding chairs had been arranged in neat rows facing a slightly elevated stage, where a well-worn Yamaha grand piano sat under warm stage lighting. Parents and family members filed in gradually, many clutching programs printed on cream-colored paper, their faces showing the mixture of pride and polite obligation that characterized these small-town musical events. Margaret Foster sat in the back row, her hands folded in her lap, her posture perfect despite the uncomfortable metal chair. At 73 years old, she had the kind of composed dignity that made people assume she had lived a quiet, uneventful life. Her silver hair was pulled back in a simple bun, and she wore a navy cardigan over a white blouse, the kind of outfit that blended seamlessly into any gathering without drawing attention. She had arrived early, as was her habit, and had watched the room fill with younger parents fussing over their children, adjusting collars and smoothing hair, offering last-minute encouragement and gentle warnings about nerves. Margaret was the oldest student enrolled at the Westbrook Music Academy by several decades. She had started lessons only 8 months earlier, a decision that had surprised her daughter Linda and confused her grandchildren, who could not understand why someone her age would suddenly decide to learn piano. Margaret had not tried to explain it to them in any detailed way, had simply said that it was something she wanted to do, a small project to keep her mind active in retirement. They had accepted this explanation with the kind of patronizing kindness that made Margaret feel both grateful and slightly invisible. The recital program listed 23 performers, ranging from a 6-year-old playing a simplified version of Twinkle Twinkle Little Star to several advanced high school students who would perform challenging pieces by Chopin and Liszt. Margaret's name appeared near the end of the program, sandwiched between a teenage boy playing Beethoven and a 12-year-old girl who would close the recital with a Rachmaninoff prelude. Next to her name was listed her piece, Bach's Prelude in C major from the Well-Tempered Clavier, Book 1. It was a beginner piece by most standards, something that serious piano students often learned in their first or second year of study. Margaret had agonized over whether to participate in the recital at all. Her teacher, a patient woman in her 40s named Jennifer Hayes, had encouraged all students to perform regardless of their level, explaining that the experience of playing in front of an audience was essential for musical development. But Margaret knew what she would look like up there, an elderly woman playing a simple piece surrounded by children and teenagers with far more skill and far more years ahead of them to develop that skill. She had almost declined, had drafted an email to Jennifer explaining that she preferred to keep her lessons private, but in the end she had deleted the message and signed up. The recital began promptly at 2 o'clock with welcoming remarks from Jennifer, who stood at the side of the stage with a warm smile and genuine enthusiasm for her students. She thanked the families for coming and reminded everyone that music was a journey, not a destination, that every performer today deserved celebration for their courage and dedication. The first student, a small boy with enormous brown eyes and a bow tie, made his way to the piano bench with visible nervousness. He played his simple melody with concentration, missing a few notes but completing the piece with a look of relief and accomplishment. The afternoon proceeded in this fashion, one student after another approaching the piano, some confident and polished, others clearly struggling with nerves or technical limitations. Margaret watched each performance with careful attention, noting the different levels of preparation and natural ability, seeing herself reflected in the anxious ones who rushed through difficult passages or froze momentarily when they lost their place. The audience responded to each performer with generous applause, the kind of supportive encouragement that small communities offered their young people. As the program moved forward and Margaret's turn drew closer, she felt her heart rate increasing and her palms beginning to sweat despite the cool temperature of the auditorium. She had practiced her Bach prelude hundreds of times over the past months, knew every note and every finger position, had worked through the piece slowly and methodically until she could play it cleanly from beginning to end. But practicing alone in her living room was entirely different from performing in front of an audience, even a small and friendly one like this. Margaret thought about the piano that sat in her living room now, the beautiful upright she had purchased shortly after starting lessons. It had been an extravagant purchase by her usual standards, but she had wanted a quality instrument, something worthy of the commitment she was making. Her husband Robert had been dead for 5 years, and the house had felt increasingly empty and purposeless in his absence. Her children had their own lives, her grandchildren were growing up and needed her less, and Margaret had found herself facing long days with nothing particular to fill them. The decision to learn piano had come from a memory that had surfaced unexpectedly one evening as she was sorting through old photographs. She had found a picture of herself as a young girl, perhaps 9 or 10 years old, sitting at a piano with a look of intense concentration on her face. Margaret had stared at that photograph for a long time, trying to remember the girl she had been, trying to recall the music she had played. The memories had come back slowly, fragmented but real. She had taken piano lessons as a child, had shown enough promise that her teacher had talked about advanced study and possible competitions. But her family had not had much money, and when her father lost his job during a recession, the piano lessons were one of the first expenses to be cut. Margaret had been 12 years old when the lessons stopped. She remembered crying about it, remembered her mother explaining gently that some things were necessities and some things were luxuries, and that music fell into the second category when times were hard. Margaret had told herself it did not matter, that she would return to piano someday when she was older and had her own money. But life had moved forward in the way it does, carrying her along with its currents and demands. She had finished school, married young, had children, worked various jobs to help support the family, managed a household and all the endless tasks that came with raising a family and building a life. The years had passed quickly, each one full of obligations and responsibilities, and people who needed her attention and energy. Piano had remained a distant memory, something from childhood that belonged to a different person in a different time. Now sitting in the community center auditorium waiting for her turn to perform, Margaret felt the weight of all those years, all those choices and necessities that had pushed her dreams aside. She was not bitter about it, had lived a good life filled with love and meaningful work, but there was still something unfinished, something that had been calling to her more insistently as she aged and understood that time was not infinite, that opportunities delayed too long became opportunities lost forever. The teenage boy before her on the program finished his Beethoven sonata to enthusiastic applause. Margaret watched him bow and return to his seat, looking relieved and pleased with himself. Jennifer approached the microphone to introduce the next performer, and Margaret heard her own name spoken aloud, heard herself described as an adult student who had begun piano lessons later in life, heard the words that marked her as different from everyone else who had performed today. Claude is AI and can make mistakes. Please double-check responses. Margaret stood from her chair with as much grace as she could manage, aware that every eye in the auditorium had turned toward her with curiosity and perhaps a touch of surprise. She had not expected to feel quite so exposed, quite so vulnerable as she made her way down the center aisle toward the stage. The walk seemed impossibly long, each step requiring conscious effort and concentration. She could hear whispers from some of the younger audience members, could sense the shift in atmosphere as people processed the unusual sight of an elderly woman preparing to perform in a recital dominated by children and teenagers. As she climbed the 3 steps to the stage, Margaret gripped the railing firmly, mindful of her balance and determined not to stumble in front of all these witnesses. She reached the piano and stood beside it for a moment, looking out at the sea of faces watching her with varying expressions of interest, skepticism, and polite encouragement. She recognized a few people from around town, neighbors she saw at the grocery store or the library, people who knew her as the quiet widow who lived alone in the house on Maple Street and kept her garden immaculately maintained. Margaret adjusted the piano bench, moving it slightly forward to accommodate her shorter stature, buying herself a few extra seconds to calm her racing heart. She sat down and placed her hands in her lap, taking a deep breath and trying to remember everything Jennifer had taught her about performance anxiety. Focus on the music, not the audience. Trust your preparation. Remember that mistakes are part of being human and that perfection is not the goal. She had repeated these mantras to herself countless times during practice, but now they felt flimsy and inadequate against the weight of actual performance pressure. She lifted her hands and positioned them over the keys, her fingers finding their starting placement through muscle memory developed over months of repetition. The opening notes of the Bach prelude were simple, just a flowing pattern of arpeggios that established the harmonic foundation of the piece. Margaret had always loved this prelude, had been drawn to its mathematical precision and emotional clarity, the way Bach had created something so beautiful from such straightforward musical materials. She knew that more advanced musicians might consider it elementary, but to her, it represented both a connection to her childhood dreams and a symbol of her current courage in pursuing something difficult at an age when most people had stopped challenging themselves. Margaret began to play, her fingers pressing down on the keys with the careful deliberateness of someone still consciously thinking about technique. The notes emerged from the piano clearly but tentatively, lacking the flowing confidence that the piece required. She was hyper-aware of every sound, every small imperfection in her touch, every place where her rhythm wavered slightly or her fingers did not move as smoothly as they should. She could feel tension building in her shoulders and arms, the physical manifestation of her anxiety making it harder to play with the relaxed naturalness that good piano performance required. About 20 measures into the piece, Margaret's left hand stumbled slightly on a chord change, the timing off just enough to create a small break in the musical line. She felt a flash of panic, her worst fears about public failure seeming to materialize in that moment. For a terrible second, she considered stopping entirely, apologizing to the audience and fleeing the stage, abandoning this foolish attempt to reclaim something from her past. But she pushed through the moment, forcing her hands to continue, recovering the rhythm and moving forward even as her confidence crumbled further. The audience had grown very quiet in a way that felt different from the supportive silence they had offered the younger performers. Margaret could sense their discomfort, their uncertainty about how to respond to this elderly woman struggling through a beginner piece. Some people were likely feeling sympathetic, admiring her bravery even while wincing at her obvious nervousness. Others were probably wondering why she was putting herself through this, questioning the wisdom of learning piano at her age, perhaps even judging her for taking up space in a recital that should be reserved for young people with actual futures in music. Margaret reached the halfway point of the prelude, where the harmonic progression shifted and the emotional quality of the music deepened. She had always loved this section, had practiced it over and over because of the way the chords resolved and created moments of unexpected beauty. But now, in performance, she was too anxious to fully appreciate what she was playing. Her focus had narrowed to simply getting through each measure without making additional mistakes, to surviving this experience rather than truly engaging with the music. As she continued playing, Margaret became aware of something shifting inside herself. The initial panic was still there, still making her hands shake slightly and her breathing shallow, but underneath it was emerging a different feeling, something like defiance or determination. She thought about all the reasons she had almost not participated in this recital, all the voice in her head that had told her she was too old, too much of a beginner, too likely to embarrass herself. She thought about the 12-year-old girl she had been when her piano lessons ended, the disappointment and resignation she had felt, the way she had learned to accept that some dreams were not meant for people like her. But she was not that powerless child anymore. She was a woman who had lived 7 decades, who had raised children and buried a husband, and survived losses and disappointments that would have broken younger, supposedly stronger people. She had earned the right to pursue whatever brought her joy or meaning, regardless of whether she did it perfectly or whether other people understood. The thought gave her a small surge of courage, enough to relax her shoulders slightly and let her hands move a bit more freely across the keys. The final section of the prelude approached, the ascending progressions that would bring the piece to its gentle conclusion. Margaret played through this section with growing confidence, her fingers finding the notes more surely now, the rhythm settling into something closer to the flowing quality she had worked so hard to achieve in practice. She was not playing perfectly by any standard, and she knew it, but she was playing honestly, putting herself and her efforts on display without pretense or apology. Margaret struck the final chord and held it, letting the sound resonate through the auditorium before lifting her hands from the keys. For a moment there was complete silence, and she braced herself for whatever response would come. She had done it, had actually performed in public despite her fear and her awareness of her limitations. Whatever happened next, she had proven something to herself, had taken back a small piece of the dream that had been taken from her 60 years earlier. The applause that began was polite and measured, the kind of response that acknowledged effort more than achievement. Margaret stood from the piano bench and gave a small bow, her face warm with embarrassment but also with a strange sense of accomplishment. She had not played particularly well, had made mistakes that everyone surely noticed, but she had completed the piece and had done so with a dignity that felt important even if it was not impressive. She walked off stage with her head held high, returning to her seat in the back row while Jennifer introduced the final performer of the afternoon. As Margaret sat down, she noticed the looks from people around her, expressions that ranged from admiration to pity to confusion. A woman in the row ahead turned and smiled at her, offering a thumbs-up gesture that Margaret appreciated even while finding it slightly condescending. She tried to focus on the young girl now playing the Rachmaninoff Prelude, a technically brilliant performance that showcased years of intensive training and natural talent, but Margaret found her attention drifting to her own internal landscape, processing what had just happened and how she felt about it. The recital concluded shortly after, and people began gathering in the lobby where refreshments had been set out on long tables covered with paper tablecloths. Margaret considered slipping out quickly to avoid the inevitable awkward conversations, but Jennifer spotted her and made her way through the crowd with obvious purpose. Jennifer embraced Margaret warmly, telling her how proud she was, how courageous it had been to perform, how much progress Margaret had made in just 8 months of study. The praise felt genuine, but also reminded Margaret of how differently her performance would be evaluated compared to the younger students, judged not on musical merit, but on the bravery of attempting something at her age. Other people approached with similar comments, all framed around her age and her courage rather than her actual playing. A man she recognized from church told her she was an inspiration, that he wished he had her determination to try new things. A mother of one of the younger students said it was wonderful to see someone prove you are never too old to learn. Margaret smiled and thanked them all, accepting the compliments graciously while feeling increasingly certain that everyone saw her as a novelty act rather than a serious student of music. She was preparing to leave when a woman she did not recognize approached, someone who had been sitting near the front during the performance. The woman appeared to be in her 50s, professionally dressed in a way that suggested she was not simply a parent attending her child's recital. She introduced herself as Dr. Patricia Morrison, a music professor at the State University about 40 miles away. She asked if Margaret had a few minutes to talk, her tone suggesting this was more than casual small talk. They found a quiet corner away from the main crowd, and Patricia explained that she had come to the recital specifically to hear her niece perform, but had been struck by Margaret's performance for reasons that had nothing to do with technical proficiency. She said she had been researching adult music education for a paper she was writing about neuroplasticity and lifelong learning, and that she was particularly interested in people who returned to music after long absences or who started learning instruments later in life. She asked Margaret if she would be willing to share her story, to talk about why she had started piano lessons and what the experience had been like. Margaret was surprised by the request but found herself agreeing, perhaps because Patricia seemed genuinely interested in her experience rather than simply being polite or patronizing. They exchanged contact information, and Patricia promised to reach out within the next week to arrange a longer conversation. As they parted, Patricia said something that stayed with Margaret through the drive home and into the evening. She said that in her research she had found that older adults often brought emotional depth and life experience to music that younger students could not access. That technical facility was only one dimension of musical expression, and often not the most important one. That night, alone in her house, Margaret sat at her piano and played through the Bach prelude again, this time without the pressure of performance or the awareness of watching eyes. She played it slowly and deliberately, listening to each chord and progression, hearing the mathematics and the beauty that Bach had encoded in these simple patterns. She thought about Patricia's comment about emotional depth and wondered if there was truth in it, or if it was simply a kind way of saying that older beginners would never match the technical skills of younger students. Margaret had always been realistic about her limitations as a pianist. She had started too late to develop the kind of virtuosic technique that required years of childhood training when the brain and hands were most malleable. She would never perform the Liszt or Rachmaninoff that the advanced students played with such apparent ease. But perhaps that was not the only way to engage with music, not the only valid reason to dedicate time and effort to learning an instrument. Perhaps there was value in the pursuit itself, in the daily practice and incremental progress, in the connection to something beautiful and transcendent that music provided. Over the following week, Margaret returned to her regular practice routine, working on new pieces Jennifer had assigned while also continuing to refine the Bach prelude. She found that something had shifted in her relationship with the piano since the recital. The performance, despite its imperfections and her anxiety, had somehow freed her from certain fears. She had done the thing she most dreaded, had exposed her limitations in public and had survived it. The worst had happened or something close to it, and yet she was still here, still playing, still finding joy and meaning in the practice. Patricia called as promised and arranged to visit Margaret at her home for an extended interview. When she arrived, she brought recording equipment and a detailed questionnaire, approaching the conversation with academic rigor while also showing genuine curiosity about Margaret's experiences. They talked for nearly 3 hours, covering Margaret's childhood piano lessons, the reasons they had ended, the decades of longing for music that she had pushed aside, the decision to finally return to lessons in her 70s. Margaret found herself sharing things she had not articulated even to herself, thoughts and feelings about aging and purpose, and the fear of becoming invisible that many older people experienced but rarely discussed openly. She talked about how learning piano had given her a sense of growth and possibility at a time when society seemed to expect nothing from her, except quiet decline into irrelevance. She described the frustration of her limitations, the way her fingers did not always cooperate or her memory failed to retain information as quickly as it once had, but also the deep satisfaction of slow progress, of mastering something difficult through patient, persistent effort. Patricia listened with focused attention, occasionally asking clarifying questions or prompting Margaret to expand on particular points. She explained that her research was revealing patterns among adult learners that challenged conventional wisdom about music education. The traditional model assumed that serious musical training had to begin in early childhood to be effective, that the window for developing high-level skills closed after a certain age. But Patricia was finding evidence that adults brought different strengths to musical learning, that maturity and life experience could compensate for some of the neurological advantages that children possessed. She told Margaret about other adult students she had interviewed, people who had started instruments in their 60s, 70s, and even 80s, who reported profound benefits that went beyond musical achievement. Many described improved cognitive function, better emotional regulation, increased social connection, and a renewed sense of purpose. The act of learning something difficult, of making themselves vulnerable as beginners, seemed to have transformative effects that rippled through other areas of their lives. Margaret found this perspective both validating and challenging. It suggested that her decision to learn piano was worthwhile even if she never achieved conventional markers of success, but it also raised questions about what she actually wanted from this pursuit. Was she content to be a hobbyist, someone who played for personal enjoyment without any larger ambitions? Or was there still some part of her that wanted recognition, that wanted to be seen as a real musician rather than an admirable curiosity? As their conversation wound down, Patricia mentioned that she was organizing a special concert at the university as part of her research project. The concert would feature exclusively adult learners, people who had started or returned to music later in life, performing pieces at various levels of difficulty. The goal was to showcase the diversity of adult musical engagement and to challenge assumptions about who could be considered a serious musician. She asked if Margaret would consider participating, performing a piece of her choice in front of an audience that would include music faculty, students, and members of the general public interested in lifelong learning. Margaret's immediate reaction was to decline. The recital had been difficult enough, and that had been in front of a small, friendly audience in her own community. Performing at a university, in front of music professionals who would surely judge her against much higher standards, seemed like an invitation to humiliation. But Patricia pushed back gently, arguing that the whole point of the concert was to expand definitions of musical achievement, to create space for different kinds of excellence beyond technical virtuosity. She explained that the concert would include performers at all levels, from people who had been playing for decades but started late, to relative beginners like Margaret who were still developing fundamental skills. The audience would understand that they were witnessing a different kind of musical event, one focused on the human stories behind the performances as much as the performances themselves. Patricia said she believed Margaret's story was particularly compelling, that hearing about her childhood lessons and the 60-year gap before returning to piano would resonate with many people who had deferred their own dreams. Margaret asked for time to think about it, promising to give Patricia an answer within the next 2 weeks. After Patricia left, Margaret sat at her piano and tried to imagine herself performing in a university concert hall, surrounded by people with advanced musical training and sophisticated tastes. The thought filled her with the same anxiety she had felt before the recital, but there was also something else, a small flicker of excitement or possibility that she could not entirely dismiss. She called her daughter Linda that evening and told her about the conversation with Patricia and the invitation to perform in the concert. Linda's response was cautious, expressing concern that Margaret might be setting herself up for disappointment or embarrassment. She reminded her mother that there was no shame in pursuing piano as a private hobby, that not everything had to be public or validated by external recognition. Margaret heard the love and protectiveness in Linda's words, but also detected an assumption that she found troubling. The idea that at her age she should be content with small, private pleasures rather than risking larger, more public endeavors. The conversation with Linda crystallized something for Margaret. She realized that part of what had drawn her back to piano was not just the love of music itself, but the desire to be seen differently, to be recognized as someone still growing and striving rather than someone simply maintaining or declining. The recital had been a step in that direction, but it had also revealed how easily older people were categorized as inspiring for merely attempting things rather than for achieving them. The university concert might offer a different kind of recognition, one based on being part of a broader conversation about lifelong learning and challenging age-based assumptions. Over the next several days, Margaret wrestled with the decision. She made lists of reasons to accept and reasons to decline, tried to imagine both scenarios and how she would feel about each choice months or years from now. She practiced her piano with increased intensity, working on pieces that were more challenging than the Bach prelude, pushing herself to see what might be possible with focused effort. She also spent time researching adult music learners online, reading their stories and experiences, looking for guidance or wisdom that might inform her decision. What she found was a community of people across the world who had made similar choices to hers, who had started or returned to music education despite being told they were too old or that it was pointless at their age. Some of these people had achieved remarkable things, performing in amateur orchestras or giving recitals or even making recordings. Others played only for themselves and their families, finding joy and meaning in the practice without needing external validation. Both paths seemed valid and worthwhile, but Margaret knew she needed to be honest with herself about which one aligned with her actual desires rather than what she thought she should want. She thought about her husband Robert, who had always encouraged her to pursue her interests, and who had never bought into conventional ideas about age-appropriate behavior. He had taken up painting in his 60s and had created dozens of works that now hung throughout her house, visual reminders of his belief that creativity and growth were lifelong possibilities. Margaret wished she could ask him what to do, though she suspected she already knew what he would say. He would tell her that fear was a poor reason to decline opportunities, that regret tended to accumulate around chances not taken rather than risks that did not work out as hoped. 2 weeks after Patricia's visit, Margaret called her and accepted the invitation to perform in the university concert. The decision felt both terrifying and liberating, a commitment to being visible and vulnerable in ways that went against every instinct she had developed about staying safe and inconspicuous in her later years. Patricia was delighted, immediately launching into logistics about timing and repertoire selection and rehearsal schedules. The concert was scheduled for early June, about 3 months away, giving Margaret time to prepare while also ensuring she could not overthink the decision to the point of backing out. Margaret's preparation for the university concert became the organizing principle of her life over the following months. Jennifer helped her select an appropriate piece, choosing Schumann's Traumerei from the Scenes from Childhood, a work that was more technically demanding than the Bach prelude but still within reach for a dedicated student with Margaret's background. The piece was beloved for its lyrical beauty and emotional depth, qualities that Jennifer believed Margaret could bring to life despite her technical limitations. It was also relatively short, under 3 minutes, which would allow for focused practice on every phrase and gesture. The piece challenged Margaret in new ways. Unlike the Bach, which was built on regular patterns and mathematical precision, the Schumann required more rubato, more interpretive freedom, more emotional expression that could not be reduced to following rules or executing technique correctly. Jennifer worked with Margaret on bringing out the singing quality of the melody, on shaping phrases to create natural breathing and tension, on using dynamics and timing to communicate the dreamy, nostalgic character that Schumann had intended. Margaret practiced obsessively, often 4 or 5 hours a day, far more than Jennifer recommended. She worked through the technical passages slowly, isolating difficult transitions and repeating them until they became more secure. She listened to dozens of recordings by famous pianists, studying their interpretive choices, noting the places where they pulled back or pushed forward, where they emphasized certain voices or created specific colors. She recorded herself playing and listened back critically, hearing all the places where her performance fell short of her intentions. The intensive practice took a physical toll. Margaret developed tension in her shoulders and neck from long sessions at the piano without adequate breaks. Her hands became sore, the joints aching in ways that reminded her of her age and the accumulated wear on her body. Jennifer warned her about the risk of injury, insisted on exercises and stretching routines, encouraged her to practice smarter rather than simply longer. But Margaret found it difficult to moderate her effort, driven by a perfectionism that she recognized was probably unhealthy but felt necessary given the stakes. As the concert date approached, Patricia invited all the performers to a preliminary meeting at the university to meet each other and discuss the event's goals and format. Margaret drove to the university on a Saturday morning in late April, her stomach tight with anxiety about meeting the other adult learners and comparing herself to whatever skills and experience they might bring. The meeting was held in a large rehearsal room in the music building, a space lined with practice rooms and filled with the sound of students working on various instruments. The other performers in Patricia's concert were a diverse group, ranging in age from their late 30s to early 80s, with backgrounds and stories that varied widely. There was Thomas, a 65-year-old retired engineer who had taken up the cello 5 years earlier and played with an amateur chamber group. There was Susan, a 42-year-old physician who had studied violin as a child but quit in high school and recently returned to it with serious dedication. There was James, an 81-year-old former minister who had started learning classical guitar in his 70s and performed regularly at assisted living facilities. Each person shared their story with the group, and Margaret was struck by the common threads that emerged. Almost everyone described some version of deferred dreams, of practical necessities taking precedence over artistic pursuits, of reaching a point in life where they decided to reclaim something they had loved or always wanted to try. Many spoke about the judgment they faced from others, the incredulity or condescension that greeted their announcements that they were seriously studying music at their age. Several described how learning their instrument had become central to their sense of identity and purpose, filling needs they had not even realized were unmet. When it was Margaret's turn to speak, she found herself sharing more than she had planned, talking about the photograph of her childhood self at the piano and the 60 years that had passed before she returned to lessons. She described the recital and her feelings of inadequacy, but also the strange liberation that came from performing despite fear and imperfection. She admitted that she still struggled with whether she had any right to call herself a musician when her skills were so limited, when she would never achieve the level of technical mastery that seemed to define serious musical engagement. Her honesty seemed to resonate with the group. Several people nodded in recognition, and Thomas spoke up to say that he struggled with similar doubts about legitimacy, wondering if amateur musicians like them were deluding themselves by taking their practice so seriously. But Patricia intervened with a perspective that shifted the conversation. She argued that the distinction between amateur and professional, between serious and casual, was often based on arbitrary criteria that privileged certain kinds of achievement over others. She pointed to research showing that adult music learners often developed deeper emotional connections to music than child prodigies, who had been pushed into intensive training before they could choose for themselves. She talked about the neurological benefits of learning music at any age, the way it created new neural pathways and enhanced cognitive reserve that could protect against age-related decline. She suggested that perhaps the measure of musical seriousness should not be technical prowess but depth of engagement, commitment to practice, and the meaning that music brought to one's life. The discussion continued for over an hour, with the group exploring questions about artistic identity, societal expectations about aging, and the different forms that musical excellence could take. Margaret found herself thinking about these questions long after the meeting ended, reconsidering assumptions she had held about what it meant to be a musician, and whether there might be validity in paths that looked different from traditional models of conservatory training and professional performance careers. In the weeks leading up to the concert, Margaret experienced cycles of confidence and doubt that seemed to intensify as the performance date drew closer. Some practice sessions went well, with the Schumann flowing smoothly and expressively, moments when she felt genuinely connected to the music and capable of communicating its emotional content. Other sessions were frustrating disasters, her fingers stumbling over passages she thought she had mastered, her interpretive choices feeling forced or artificial, her overall performance seeming hopelessly inadequate for a university concert hall. The morning of the concert arrived with unseasonably warm weather, bright sunshine flooding through Margaret's kitchen windows as she tried to eat breakfast despite having no appetite. She had slept poorly, waking repeatedly with anxiety dreams about performing, about forgetting the music or breaking down in the middle of the piece or facing an audience that laughed at her presumption. She knew these fears were irrational or at least exaggerated, but knowing that did not make them less visceral or overwhelming. Margaret drove to the university in the early afternoon, arriving several hours before the scheduled concert to take advantage of the practice rooms Patricia had reserved for performers. The music building was quieter than it had been during her previous visit, most students gone for the weekend or finished with their own practice sessions. She found the assigned practice room and sat down at the upright piano, her hands trembling slightly as she began her warm-up exercises. She worked through scales and arpeggios, familiar patterns that helped settle her nerves and prepare her fingers for the demands ahead. Then she turned to the Schumann, playing through it several times, trying to find the right balance between control and expression, between executing the notes correctly and communicating the dreamy nostalgia that the piece required. Each run-through revealed small issues, places where her timing wavered or her dynamics were too cautious, imperfections that she tried to address in subsequent attempts. Patricia stopped by the practice room to check on all the performers, offering encouragement and reminding them that the concert was meant to celebrate their dedication rather than to judge their technical proficiency. She told Margaret that a good-sized audience was expected, including several local media representatives interested in the lifelong learning angle, and that the university's marketing department had promoted the event as part of their community engagement initiatives. The information made Margaret's anxiety spike even higher, the thought of performing in front of reporters and cameras adding new layers of pressure to an already stressful situation. As the concert time approached, the performers gathered backstage in the concert hall, a beautiful space with excellent acoustics and seating for about 400 people. Margaret could hear the audience filing in, the sounds of conversation and rustling programs, the anticipation building in the hall. She peeked through the curtain and saw that the seats were nearly full, a much larger crowd than she had expected, people of all ages settling in with expressions of curiosity and interest. The concert began with Thomas playing a Bach cello suite, his performance solid and musical if not technically perfect. Margaret watched from backstage, struck by how different the experience was from watching student recitals or professional concerts. There was something deeply human and relatable about seeing someone her age performing with genuine commitment despite obvious nervousness and limitations. The audience responded warmly, their applause generous and encouraging, setting a tone of support and appreciation that continued throughout the evening. Susan performed next, playing a Vivaldi violin concerto movement with a community orchestra member providing piano accompaniment. Her playing was more advanced than Thomas's, her years of childhood training evident in her confident technique and musical phrasing. Margaret felt a pang of envy watching her, wishing she had Susan's level of skill, wishing she had not lost 60 years that might have allowed her to develop similar capabilities. But she also recognized the destructive nature of such comparisons, the way they undermined her own achievements and missed the point of what this concert was trying to accomplish. James performed a classical guitar piece by Fernando Sor, his elderly hands moving across the fretboard with careful deliberation. There were moments where his fingers did not quite reach their targets or where the rhythm hesitated, but there was also undeniable musicality in his playing, a depth of feeling that transcended technical concerns. The audience listened with rapt attention, and Margaret noticed several people wiping their eyes during his performance, moved by something beyond the notes themselves. Then it was Margaret's turn. Patricia announced her to the audience, sharing a brief version of her story about childhood lessons and the long gap before returning to piano. Margaret walked onto the stage with her heart pounding, the bright stage lights momentarily disorienting after the dim backstage area. The piano sat center stage, a beautiful Steinway grand that was far superior to any instrument she had practiced on. She made her way to the bench, sat down, and adjusted her position, buying a few seconds to try to calm her racing thoughts. Margaret placed her hands on the keys and closed her eyes, blocking out the audience and the hall and everything except the music she was about to play. She thought about the Schumann, about the dreamlike quality Schumann had intended, about the nostalgia and tenderness embedded in these simple melodies. She thought about her own dreams, the ones she had abandoned and the ones she had reclaimed, the journey that had brought her to this moment on this stage. She began playing, and immediately she knew something was different from all her practice sessions and different from the recital months earlier. The nerves were still there, the physical tension and the fear of failure, but underneath them was a new quality, a kind of surrender or acceptance that allowed the music to flow more naturally. Her fingers found the notes with greater sureness than she expected, her interpretive choices feeling organic rather than forced, the phrasing emerging from genuine feeling rather than calculated effort. The opening section of Traumerei unfolded with its characteristic gentleness, the melody singing out above simple harmonic support. Margaret felt herself relaxing into the music, trusting her preparation and allowing her emotional connection to the piece to guide her choices. She shaped the phrases with subtle rubato, pulling back slightly in some places and pressing forward in others, creating the ebb and flow that gave the piece its living, breathing quality. As she moved into the middle section, where the harmonies became more complex and the emotional intensity deepened, Margaret found herself thinking about all the years she had lived without music, all the experiences and losses and joys that had shaped her into the person she was now. She thought about Robert and the life they had built together, about her children and the sacrifices she had made for their welfare, about the dreams deferred and the dreams that had seemed to die but had only been sleeping. The music seemed to channel all of this, becoming a vehicle for expression that went beyond the notes on the page. Margaret played with increasing confidence and freedom, letting go of her self-consciousness and perfectionism, allowing herself to simply be present with the music and to communicate what it meant to her. She was aware that she was making small mistakes, that her technique was not polished and her touch was sometimes uneven. But these imperfections no longer seemed to matter as much as they had during anxious practice sessions. Non-judgmental environment. 6 months after the university concert, Margaret received a call from Patricia with unexpected news. A regional classical music radio station had heard about the Adult Learners concert and wanted to do a feature story about lifelong music education. They wanted to interview Patricia and several of the performers, and they wanted to record Margaret playing Traumare for broadcast. The piece would air as part of a series about music and aging, exploring how classical music engagement evolved across the lifespan. Margaret agreed to the recording session, which took place in a small studio at the radio station. She played the Schumann multiple times, the sound engineer capturing different takes and choosing the best moments from each. Hearing her playing through professional monitors, isolated and amplified, was both thrilling and humbling. She could hear all her imperfections magnified, but she could also hear the musical qualities she had worked so hard to develop, the expressive phrasing and emotional commitment that transcended technical concerns. The radio feature aired on a Sunday afternoon in early autumn, and Margaret listened to it alone in her living room, her emotions swinging between pride and embarrassment as she heard her own voice in the interview segments and her playing of Traumare interspersed with commentary from Patricia and the host. The piece positioned her story as part of a larger conversation about neuroplasticity, lifelong learning, and challenging societal assumptions about what older adults were capable of achieving. Her playing was presented not as professional-level performance, but as evidence of dedication and artistic engagement that deserved recognition regardless of technical limitations. The response to the radio feature was immediate and overwhelming. The station received dozens of emails and calls from listeners, many of them older adults who said they had been inspired by Margaret's story to pursue their own deferred dreams. Several people contacted Margaret directly through the station, wanting advice about starting music lessons or sharing their own stories of returning to abandoned pursuits. The attention was gratifying but also slightly uncomfortable, as Margaret still struggled with imposter syndrome and doubts about whether she deserved to be held up as any kind of example. But gradually, through continued practice and performance and interaction with other adult learners, Margaret's relationship with music and with herself as a musician continued to evolve. She came to understand that mastery existed on a spectrum, that there were many valid ways to engage seriously with music beyond the conservatory to concert hall pipeline that dominated traditional classical music culture. She recognized that her journey was valuable precisely because it was different from conventional paths, because it challenged narrow definitions of who could call themselves a musician and what counted as meaningful musical achievement. 2 years after that first recital at the community center, Margaret performed again at another adult learners concert Patricia organized, this time playing Debussy's Clair de Lune, a piece she had worked on intensively for months, and that represented a significant technical and musical advancement from where she had started. Her playing was still imperfect by professional standards, but it was undeniably musical, filled with the kind of emotional depth and interpretive maturity that could only come from life experience and genuine love for the music. The audience included many of the same people who had attended the previous concert, along with new faces drawn by the growing reputation of these events as celebrations of human potential and resilience. Margaret played with confidence born of hard work and self-acceptance, no longer tormented by comparisons to younger, more technically accomplished musicians, focused instead on communicating what the music meant to her and trusting that her sincere engagement would resonate with listeners. After the performance, during the reception, an elderly woman approached Margaret with tears in her eyes. She explained that she was 87 years old and had always wanted to learn piano but had convinced herself it was too late, that her arthritic hands and aging brain made it impossible. But hearing Margaret play, seeing what was possible with dedication and good instruction, had changed her mind. She asked if Margaret could recommend a teacher, if she thought it was worth starting at such an advanced age, if there was any hope of achieving something meaningful. Margaret took the woman's hands in hers and told her what she wished someone had told her decades earlier. She said that it was never too late to pursue something that called to you, that the journey itself was worthwhile regardless of where it led, that the act of learning and growing and challenging yourself was its own reward. She explained that yes, there would be frustrations and limitations, that progress would be slower than it might have been in youth, but that the depth of appreciation and commitment that came with maturity could make the experience richer in ways that compensated for lost time and diminished facility. She gave the woman Jennifer's contact information and encouraged her to start lessons, to give herself permission to be a beginner without apology or self-consciousness. The woman thanked her with obvious emotion, saying that this conversation had given her hope and courage, that she was going to call Jennifer the very next day. Margaret watched her walk away and felt a profound sense of gratitude for her own journey, for the courage she had found to return to music, for all the unexpected gifts and connections that had come from that single decision to play at the community center recital. Margaret's story became part of a growing movement of adult music learners who were challenging assumptions about aging and artistic development. Patricia's research was published and widely cited, contributing to policy changes in music education that emphasized lifelong accessibility rather than early identification of talent. Music schools began offering more programs specifically designed for adult students, recognizing this as an underserved population with unique needs and tremendous potential for meaningful engagement. Margaret continued to practice daily, always working on new pieces, always pushing slightly beyond her current abilities, always finding new depths in music she thought she understood. She performed occasionally in small venues and at adult learner events, comfortable now with her identity as a serious amateur who approached music with dedication and love, even without professional aspirations. She gave talks at senior centers and community colleges about lifelong learning and overcoming fear, sharing her story in ways that helped others find courage for their own deferred dreams. 5 years after returning to piano, Margaret celebrated her 78th birthday by giving a solo recital at the community center where her journey had begun. She performed a program of pieces she loved, from the Bach prelude that had been her first recital piece to more challenging works by Chopin, Schumann, and Debussy that represented how far she had come. The hall was filled with friends, family, students from Jennifer's studio, members of the adult learners group, and strangers who had heard about her story and wanted to witness this milestone. As Margaret sat at the piano before beginning her first piece, she looked out at the audience and felt an overwhelming sense of peace and rightness. This was where she was meant to be, doing what she was meant to do, living authentically and courageously in alignment with her deepest values and passions. The 60 years she had spent away from music were not wasted, she realized, but had given her experiences and perspectives that enriched her playing in ways that continuous study from childhood might not have provided. She placed her hands on the keys and began to play. And in that moment she was not an elderly beginner or an inspiring example or a research subject or any other label that people might apply. She was simply a musician, sharing something beautiful with people who had chosen to listen, participating in the ancient and essential human practice of making meaning through organized sound. The notes floated out into the hall, imperfect but genuine, technically limited but emotionally rich, a testament to persistence and passion and the enduring human capacity for growth and transformation at any age.